Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is a series that I'm going to be starting called Fantasy Football 201. It's a fantasy football course taught by somebody who is a fan of ways to be successful in fantasy football from one of your peers' perspective, not necessarily a fantasy football expert who does this all the time, but I have some strategies that have worked very well for me in the past that have helped me to win some fantasy football leagues, and I want to share that with you with this video series. So if you're interested in stuff like this, please like, comment, subscribe. I make a lot of videos about a lot of different topics. You can check out my channel. I have a wide variety of stuff that I talk about. But in this particular video, I'm going to be talking about 7 strategies to be successful in fantasy football and to win your league. So in the brief summary of what we're going to talk about, we're going to be talking about 2 phases of the season. We're going to be talking about the first phase, your roster construction phase, and then we're going to get into in-season moves after the draft has taken place and you've already established your lineup. So let's get into it. The first strategy of the 7 that I'm going to be talking about is draft is important, but you do not win your fantasy football league at the draft. And the reason that I'm saying this is because you can draft a good lineup and have a good collection of players on paper, but fantasy football is not a static sport. Players' values are changing all the time depending on how the team is doing, injuries, strength of schedule of defenses the teams are playing. There's all kinds of factors that change as the season goes along. So the key is that you want to make sure that you draft good players, but the key is that you have to constantly be evaluating these players' stocks and trying to improve your roster throughout the entire season. So a good example of this that I kind of equate fantasy football to is you're treating all these players as if they're stock assets, as if you're a stockbroker. So you want to try to get guys that are going to do well, and then when they have a really good game, if you don't think that's sustainable, you want to try to see what you can do to flip those players, get more consistent players. So you're constantly evaluating the status of your team, the stock of your team, and trying to get guys that can help you be successful as the season goes along. You can do this through trades. You can do this through the free agency, waiver wire pickup, things like that. But the idea is that you want to be getting guys that you're going to want to be evaluating your team throughout the year. You don't just draft a team and try to hold it. You're going to want to always take every opportunity to improve your roster and just always strive to improve. And then the other point I want to make too is that the 2 players that primarily were drafted number 1 and 2 from last year's season, this adds to my point, were Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley tore his ACL. He was out most of the year. Christian McCaffrey was in and out for most of the year as well with sprained ankles. I believe he had an elbow issue at some point. But these are 2 guys that they were not necessarily drafted. Those were 2 guys that were pretty much universally drafted number 1 and 2. But the top performer from last season was actually Alvin Kamara, who was drafted somewhere around 5 to 6. So again, it just shows that you really have to constantly be evaluating players. You can't just rely solely on people that you draft because people could get injured and then that could affect your season if you're not trying to improve. Number 2 point, you want to find guys that are going to be the focal point of your offense. So what do I mean by this? What I'm talking about is you want to find players that are going to have the offense revolve around them in terms of multiple plays. They're going to get a lot of stats. Maybe not necessarily the best teams, but you're trying to find players that really stand out on that offense that you can consistently count upon every week. Good examples of guys like this. Alvin Kamara, last year's top running back. Part of the reason it turned out that way is because Michael Thomas was in and out with injuries. Drew Brees was injured, so they had to rely on Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill not necessarily throwing the ball down the field as much. He's doing a lot of dump off to the running backs, especially if you're in a PPR league. you really got a lot of value out of Alvin Kamara for that reason. Other guys like this, Devontae Adams, Packers don't really have any other receivers. DeAndre Hopkins, one of the best receivers in the league. Even the guy who replaced DeAndre Hopkins in Houston, Will Fuller, was a kind of a guy that had a very good season up until he was suspended. Other guys like Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, Derrick Henry, things like that. Those are guys that the offense revolves around them, and you're getting that consistency that you can always rely on them to not only have a good baseline, but have a high ceiling as well when they go off. People that don't necessarily fall in this category that you would want to try to avoid are teams where you have multiple receivers, or they pass the ball around a lot to like a committee type of thing, like Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Not necessarily the best decision to go with guys like, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, because Tom Brady's going to dump it around different players all the time. The Baltimore Ravens running back scheme is always a constant flux of players. So I generally try to avoid those guys. Lamar Jackson is probably the best fantasy asset on them. But basically what I'm kind of getting at is you want to find guys that are going to stand out on offense, not necessarily guys that are going to be in an offense where there's a lot of guys that can get the ball. Number 3 point, you want to stock running backs and wide receivers on your team as your primary players. The basic breakdown of this is the standard fantasy football format, is you'll have a quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a flex, which is consistent of running back, wide receiver, tight end. You have a tight end that starts, then a defense and a kicker. So just based on the breakdown of that, 5 of your 9 positions that you're starting could either be a running back or a wide receiver. So you want to put yourself in a position where you're getting a lot of running backs and wide receivers on your team, because those are the majority of the positions that you're starting. Personally, when I construct my lineup, I only have 1 quarterback, 1 tight end, and then absolutely no exceptions, have 1 defense and 1 kicker. And then the rest of my lineup is generally going to be either running backs or wide receivers, unless there's rare circumstances where I'm playing a matchup late in the year, but I'll talk about that later on. But you want to, wide receivers and running backs are the ones that have the most room for guys that could really go off in a particular game. They're generally positions to get hurt more, so you're going to have players that are constantly in flux that'll be under the radar and then come up in the middle of the season. Quarterbacks, you don't necessarily get that as much, and quarterback production generally about the same. I'll talk about that in another video, but you don't want to try to reach for quarterbacks for some of these positions or draft multiple quarterbacks, because they're taking up positions for guys that are going to fill the majority of your starting positions. I've also got videos that I'm going to make that are going to talk about how to use strategy for tight ends, kickers, defense as well, because the kicker especially is a very interesting position in fantasy football that I've got some tricks of the trade of how to game that. But yeah, running backs and wide receivers are the ones that you want to make sure you fill your roster with. And number 4, you want to get guys that have potential over guys with modest gains that are generally veteran players. You want to go for the younger guys that have more potential. So a good example of this. So last year on the Philadelphia Eagles, they have, their constant retread of wide receivers like Deshaun Jackson, Alshon Jeffrey. Those guys are way past their prime. And last year they were pretty much injured throughout the majority of the season and were pretty much duds if you drafted them anywhere late in the draft. A guy that was not really getting as much attention was Travis Fulgham, who ended up being the best receiver on the Eagles. So if you were in a position where you were drafting late in fantasy football and you picked Deshaun Jackson and you didn't take Travis Fulgham, well, you basically wasted a draft pick on a guy that you pretty much know is either living off his past or is already hit his ceiling and he's not going to give you that kind of potential that you need to win your championship. And that's kind of the point I'm getting at, is that you're trying to compete for these fantasy football leagues to win. And what good does it do if you're getting a guy that is a third string receiver who's going to catch maybe like 2 or 3 catches a game for 40 yards and give you that floor level of 7 to 10 points? That doesn't help you win a championship at all. So you want to try to see if you can find these diamond in the rough type players that can break out for you. A good example of this, it's actually talked about a lot now, is Tim Tebow on the Jacksonville Jaguars. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to be drafting Tim Tebow. And to be honest, it's just better to go with one of these younger tight ends who haven't really proven themselves, because we kind of generally know what Tim Tebow can provide, and I don't think it's going to necessarily give you championship level tight end production. It's nothing against the guy, but that's a great example of, you want to get these players that actually have more potential than the name brand type players. Fantasy football is actually a lot of deciphering between players that are drafted high because of their name value and because of their hype, versus players that will be productive. And that actually really influences draft stock. So that's another topic I want to talk about, because I think this is a big mistake that a lot of people make when they play fantasy football, is that they take names, but they don't necessarily focus on the production that they actually provide. But yeah, so stay tuned if you're interested in more stuff like that later on. Those are my roster construction points. So now when you get to the point where you're in the middle of the season, these are the strategies that you want to do to make sure that you win your fantasy football league. Continuing on. Number 5, you want to make sure you check the waiver wires every day. So the way fantasy football works in most leagues, and last year was a little bit different because of all the games that were being postponed because of COVID, but the way it's generally going to work is that you finish your fantasy football week after Monday night. Tuesday is when the waiver wires are technically you're putting in your claims for players. Some people do it where it's just an order of who finished last for the week or who's in last place in the league. Other people actually do an auction for players. But the idea is that you want to make sure you're checking this every day, because you want to make sure that Tuesday, especially that right before the waiver wires are claimed the following day, that you're really putting in your research about who to pick up, who's going to be good for you down the stretch, or who just had a flash in the pan game that's really not going to materialize in anything of depth. That's incredibly important. And then especially each day you want to make sure that you're following up on the waivers, because there's people that are going to be dropping some valuable name players because they had a bad game week 1 or week 2. And then you can just pick those guys up for free. There was one year where somebody dropped Zach Ertz for Will Disley, and then I picked him up, and then I had Zach Ertz the rest of the season, that was back when he was, this was 2017, 2018, when he was one of the best tight ends in the league, and it was pretty much between him, Kelsey, and not even George Kittle yet at the time. So I just ended up with a top 2 tight end off waivers because somebody dropped him. So that's why you want to make sure you check it every day, is because you can really capitalize on the errors that the other people in your league are making. Number 6 point, and I already kind of talked about this a little bit, you always want to be evaluating your roster stock constantly throughout the week. I personally try to make a trade every week. It doesn't always happen, because a lot of people, it's a little difficult to, it's kind of just, it's kind of like you see it in like professional sports. It's difficult to get trades across people because you got to make a lot of negotiations. But I always at least make an attempt to do this, because if you try to do this, you're always looking to improve your roster. And really pay a lot of attention to things like the strength of schedule, the way the team is performing, things to that effect, because you really want to do a lot of research and try to make sure you're always improving your team going into that next week, and really to build the rest of your season. So that's personally what I'll try to do. And especially like if you can get when you have the running back and the roster and the wide receiver depth that I talked about, you could use those bench pieces that may have had a really good game that you have sitting on your bench, and you could actually use them as some additional assets to trade for a better player. A good example of this is one year I had Adrian Peterson, Demaryius Thomas, and then I think Robbie Anderson. And I traded all of them after week 1 for Kareem Hunt because Kareem Hunt in that first game of that season had a really bad game. But then the rest of the year I had like a running back 1. Well, until he got suspended, actually. But I mean, that's kind of the idea that I'm getting at, is that when you have the running back and wide receiver depth, you can use that to make these trades. And that's basically what you want to constantly be doing week by week, is finding ways that you can improve your team. And then my 7th point that I want to make is when you get the depth of everybody that you want on your team gearing up to that weekend, all your running backs, wide receivers that you've acquired for the week on waivers, etc., you want to reach out for advice on the matchup. Personally, in terms of advice that I reach out to, the best, in terms of the best bang for your buck, I think that the fantasy footballers are probably the most entertaining one to watch. They're very knowledgeable, especially one of them in particular is very good. His name is Jason. I follow his advice the most. The show is also hilarious, so that's also fun to watch too. But the thing is that they make an hour video a day, so you really have to devote a lot of time to that. If you're in a situation where you're very busy and you really kind of don't have time to do that, CBS Sports, the articles they put out, I believe his name is Jamie Eisenberg. Those are some of the most informative fantasy football stuff. I do not watch ESPN. I think Matthew Berry is just flat wrong on pretty much everything that he says. I think that, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff too. I don't even really know what it is necessarily. But I mean, the things that always work for me are CBS Sports if I don't have time, and then Fantasy Footballers if I do have time. Those are the best resources. And then also you could just like ask friends or ask like people that you're on Twitter with or whatever. And it's just good to get different ideas. I don't always necessarily go with the advice because sometimes I have a gut feeling about something and I just go with it anyway. But it's good to at least get that perspective of what other people are thinking, because that'll build your plan for how you're going to go about that week and set yourself up for winning that week. And then just in general, you just take it week by week. And if you follow those first 4 steps before the draft, and then you follow those steps 5, 6, 7 that I just said week by week, you'll generally put yourself in a position where you're going to be successful at fantasy football. So that's all I've got for today's video. In the future, what I plan to do is I'm going to do a preview of every single team. It's going to be about a 10-minute video where I go over the fantasy football projections. I know there's a lot of things that can change between now and the start of the season, but hopefully this will give you an idea of the players to look out for in individual teams. And then as I start getting past that and we get closer to fantasy football drafts, I'm going to talk draft strategies, some particular points on those first 4 points that I made in terms of the 7 draft strategies to be successful. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. And once again, if you're interested in a lot of variety of content, from song covers to song reactions to sports, etc., please comment, like, or subscribe, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. So, all right, well, thanks for watching. See you guys.